Welcome to Storytime with Someone Else's Mom. With me, Someone Else's Mom. Today, we're going to start a two-parter so that we can read James Thurber's The 13 Clocks. It's a thin little book, so 2 parts and we'll be done. This is an absolutely fabulous read. I cherish it. And a shout out to my friend Dave, who introduced me to James Thurber so many years ago. Dooful Dave. Grown-ups, you want to stay too? If only because when your children start gleeping and having nightmares about the total, you're going to be wondering where that came from. So stick around and you'll find out. James Thurber's The 13 Clocks. Once upon a time, in a gloomy castle on a lonely hill, where there were 13 clocks that wouldn't go, there lived a cold, aggressive duke and his niece, the Princess Saralinda. She was warm in every wind and weather, but he was always cold. His hands were as cold as his smile, and almost as cold as his heart. He wore gloves when he was asleep, and he wore gloves when he was awake, which made it difficult for him to pick up pins or coins or the kernels of nuts, or to tear the wings from nightingales. He was 6'4" and 46, and even colder than he thought he was. One eye wore a velvet patch. The other glittered through a monocle, which made half his body seem closer to you than the other half. He had lost one eye when he was 12, for he was fond of peering into nests and lairs in search of birds and animals to maul. One afternoon, a mother shrike had mauled him first. His nights were spent in evil dreams, and his days were given to wicked schemes. Wickedly scheming, he would limp and cackle through the cold corridors of the castle, planning new impossible feats for the suitors of Saralinda to perform. He did not wish to give her hand in marriage, since her hand was the only warm hand in the castle. Even the hands of his watch and the hands of all the 13 clocks were frozen. They had all frozen at the same time on a snowy night 7 years before, and after that it was always 10 minutes to 5 in the castle. Travelers and mariners would look up at the gloomy castle on the lonely hill and say, "Time lies frozen there. It's always then. It's never now." The cold duke was afraid of now, for now has warmth and urgency, and then is dead and buried. Now might bring a certain night of gay and shining courage. But no, the cold duke muttered, the prince will break himself against a new and awful labor, a place too high to reach, a thing too far to find, a burden too heavy to lift. The duke was afraid of now, but he tampered with the clocks to see if they would go, out of a strange perversity, praying that they wouldn't. Tinkers and tinkerers and a few wizards who happened by tried to start the clocks with tools or magic words, or by shaking them and cursing, but nothing whirred or ticked. The clocks were dead, and in the end, brooding on it, the duke decided he had murdered time, slain it with his sword, and wiped his bloody blade upon its beard and left it lying there, bleeding hours and minutes, its springs uncoiled and sprawling, its pendulum disintegrating. The duke limped because his legs were of different lengths. The right one had outgrown the left because when he was young, he had spent his mornings place-kicking puppies and punting kittens. He would say to a suitor, "What is the difference in the length of my legs?" And if the youth replied, "Why, one is shorter than the other," the duke would run him through with the sword he carried in his sword cane and feed him to the geese. The suitor was supposed to say, "Why, one is longer than the other." Many a prince had been run through for naming the wrong difference. Others had been slain for offenses equally trivial, trampling the duke's camellias, failing to praise his wines, staring too long at his gloves, gazing too long at his niece. Those who survived his scorn and sword were given incredible labors to perform in order to win his niece's hand, the only warm hand in the castle, where time had frozen to death at 10 minutes to 5 one snowy night. They were told to cut a slice of moon or change the ocean into wine. They were set to finding things that never were and building things that could not be. They came and tried and failed and disappeared and never came again. And some, as I have said, were slain, for using names that start with X, or dropping spoons, or wearing rings, or speaking disrespectfully of sin. The castle and the Duke grew colder, and Saralinda, as a princess will, even in a place where time lies frozen, became a little older, but only a little older. She was nearly 21 the day a prince disguised as a minstrel came singing to the town that lay below the castle. He called himself Zingu, which was not his name, and dangerous, since the name began with X, and still does. He was, quite properly, a thing of shreds and patches, a ragged minstrel singing for pennies and the love of singing. Zingu, as he so rashly called himself, was the youngest son of a powerful king, but he had grown weary of rich attire and banquets and tournaments and the available princesses of his own realm, and yearned to find in a far land the maiden of his dreams, singing as he went, learning the life of the lowly, and possibly slaying a dragon here and there. At the sign of the Silver Swan, in the town below the castle, where taverners, travelers, tale-tellers, toss-pots, troublemakers, and other townspeople were gathered, he heard of Saralinda, loveliest princess on all the 1,000 islands of the ocean seas. "If you can turn the rain to silver, she is yours," a taverner leered. "If you can slay the thorny boar of Borrythorn, she is yours," grinned a traveler. "But there is no thorny boar of Borrythorn, which makes it hard." "What makes it even harder is her uncle's scourge and sword," sneered a tale-teller. "He will slit you from your guggle to your zatch." "The Duke is 7 feet 9 inches tall and only 28 years old, or in his prime," a tosspot gurgled. "His hand is cold enough to stop a clock, strong enough to choke a bull, and swift enough to catch the wind. He breaks up minstrels in his soup like crackers." "Our minstrel here will warm the old man's heart with song, dazzle him with jewels and gold," a troublemaker simpered. "He'll trample on the Duke's camellias, spill his wine, blunt his sword, and say his name begins with X. And in the end, the Duke will say, 'Take Saralinda with my blessing, O lordly prince of rags and tags, O rider of the sun.'" The troublemaker weighed 18 stone, but the minstrel picked him up and tossed him in the air and caught him and set him down again. Then he paid his due and left the Swan. "I've seen that youth before," the traveler mused, staring after Zingu, "but he was neither ragamuffin then nor minstrel. Well, let me see, where was it?" "In his soup," the tosspot said, "like crackers." Chapter 2. Outside the tavern, the night was lighted by a rocking yellow moon that held a white star in its horn. In the gloomy castle on the hill, a lantern gleamed and darkened, came and went, as if the gaunt Duke stalked from room to room, stabbing bats and spiders, killing mice. "Dazzle the Duke with jewels," the minstrel said aloud. "There's something in it somewhere, but what it is and where I cannot think." He wondered if the Duke would order him to cause a fall of purple snow, or make a table out of sawdust, or merely slit him from his guggle to his zatch, and say to Saralinda, "There he lies, your latest fool and nameless minstrel. I'll have my varlets feed him to the geese." The minstrel shuddered in the moonlight, wondering where his zatch and guggle were. He wondered how and why and when he could invade the castle. A duke was never known to ask a ragged minstrel to his table, or set a task for him to do, or let him meet a princess. "I'll think of some way," thought the prince. "I'll think of something." The hour was late, and revelers began to reel and stagger home from inns and taverns, none in rags and none in tags, and some in velvet gowns. 1/3 of the dogs in town began to bark. The minstrel took his lute from his shoulder and improvised a song. He had thought of something. "Hark, hark, the dogs do bark, but only 1 in 3. They bark at those in velvet gowns, they never bark at me." A tale-teller, tottering home to bed, laughed at the song, and troublemakers and tosspots began to gather and listen. "The Duke is fond of velvet gowns, he'll ask you all to tea. But I'm in rags and I'm in tags, he'll never send for me." The townspeople crowded round the minstrel, laughing and cheering. "He's a bold one, Rags is, making songs about the Duke," giggled a strut furrow who had joined the crowd. The minstrel went on singing. "Hark, hark, the dogs do bark. The Duke is fond of kittens. He likes to take their insides out and use their fur for mittens." The crowd fell silent in awe and wonder, for the townspeople knew the Duke had slain 11 men for merely staring at his hands, hands that were gloved in velvet gloves, bright with rubies and with diamonds. Fearing to be seen in the doomed and desperate company of the sad minstrel, the revelers slunk off to their homes to tell their wives. Only the traveler, who thought he had seen the singer some other where and time, lingered to warn him of his peril. "I've seen you shining in the lists," he said, "or toppling knights in battle, or breaking men in two like crackers. You must be Tristram's son, or Lancelot's, or are you Tyne or Tora?" "A wandering minstrel, I," the minstrel said, "a thing of shreds and zatches." He bit his tongue in consternation at the slip it made. "Even if you were the mighty Zorn of Zorna," said the man, "you could not escape the fury of the Duke. He'll slit you from your guggle to your zatch, from here to here." He touched the minstrel's stomach and his throat. "I now know what to guard," the minstrel sighed. A black figure in velvet mask and hood and cloak disappeared behind a tree. "The cold Duke's spy-in-chief," the traveler said, "a man named Whisper. Tomorrow he will die." The minstrel waited. "He'll die because to name your sins he'll have to mention mittens. I leave at once for other lands since I have mentioned mittens." He sighed. "He'll never live to wed his niece. He'll only die to feed his geese. Goodbye, good night, and sorry." The traveler vanished like a fly in the mouth of a frog, and the minstrel was left alone in the dark, deserted street. Somewhere a clock dropped a stony chime into the night. The minstrel began to sing again. A soft finger touched his shoulder, and he turned to see a little man smiling in the moonlight. He wore an indescribable hat. His eyes were wide and astonished, as if everything were happening for the first time, and he had a dark, describable beard. "If you have nothing better than your songs," he said, "you are somewhat less than much, and only a little more than anything." "I manage in my fashion," the minstrel said, and he strummed his lute and sang, "Hark, hark, the dogs do bark, the cravens are going to bed. Some will rise and greet the sun, but Whisper will be dead." The old man lost his smile. "Who are you?" the minstrel asked. "I am the Golux," said the Golux proudly, "the only Golux in the world, and not a mere device." "You resemble one," the minstrel said, "as Sarah Linda resembles the rose." "I resemble only half the things I say I don't," the Golux said. "The other half resemble me." He sighed. "I must always be on hand when people are in peril." "My peril is my own," the minstrel said. "Half of it is yours, and half of it is Sarah Linda's." "I hadn't thought of that," the minstrel said. "I place my faith in you, and where you lead, I follow." "Not so fast," the Golux said. "Half the places I have been to never were. I make things up. Half the things I say there are cannot be found. When I was young, I told a tale of buried gold, and men from leagues around dug in the woods. I dug myself. But why? I thought the tale of treasure might be true." "You said you made it up." "I know I did, but then I didn't know I had. I forget things too." The minstrel felt a vague uncertainty. "I make mistakes, but I am on the side of good," the Golux said, "by accident and happen chance. I had high hopes of being evil when I was 2, but in my youth I came upon a firefly burning in a spider's web. I saved the victim's life." "The fireflies," said the minstrel. "The spiders! The blinking arsonist had set the web on fire." The minstrel's uncertainty increased, but as he thought to slip away, a deep bell sounded in the castle, and many lights appeared, and voices shouted orders and commands. A stream of lanterns started flowing down the darkness. "The Duke has heard your songs," the Golux said. The fat is in the fire, the die is cast, the jig is up, the goose is cooked, and the cat is out of the bag. My hour has struck, the minstrel said. They heard a faint and distant rasping sound, as if a blade of steel were being sharpened on a stone. The Duke prepares to feed you to his geese, the Golok said. We must invent a tale to stay his hand. What manner of tale? The minstrel asked. A tale, the Golok said, to make the Duke believe that slaying you would light a light in someone else's heart. He hates a light in people's hearts. So you must say, a certain prince and princess can't be wed until the evening of the second day after the Duke has fed you to his geese. I wish you would not keep saying that, the minstrel said. The tale sounds true, the Golok said, and very like a witch's spell. The Duke has awe of witches' spells. I'm certain he will stay his hand. I think. The sound of tramping feet came near and nearer. The iron guards of the Duke closed in, their lanterns gleaming and their spears and armor. Halt! There was a clang and clanking. Do not arrest my friend, the youth implored. What friend? The captain growled. The minstrel looked around him and about, but there was no one there. A guard guffawed and said, Maybe he's seen the Goloks. There isn't any Goloks. I've been to school and know, the captain said. The minstrel's uncertainty increased again. Fall in, the captain bawled. Dress up that line. You heard him. Dress it up, the sergeant said. They marched the minstrel to the dungeon in the castle. A stream of lantern light flowed slowly up the hill. Chapter 3. It was morning. The cold Duke gazed out a window of the castle as if he were watching flowers in bloom or flying birds. He was watching his varlets feeding Whisper to the geese. He turned away and took 3 limps and stared at the minstrel, standing in the great hall of the castle, both hands bound behind him. What manner of prince is this you speak of, and what manner of maiden does he love, to use a word that makes no sense and has no point? His voice sounded like iron dropped on velvet. A noble prince, a noble lady, the minstrel said. When they are wed, 1,000,000 people will be glad. The Duke took his sword out of his sword cane and stared at it. He limped across and faced his captive and touched his guggle softly with the point, then touched his zatch, and sighed and frowned and put the sword away. We shall think of some amusing task for you to do, he said. I do not like your tricks and guile. I think there is no prince or maiden who would wed if I should slay you, but I am neither sure nor certain. He grinned and said, We'll think of some amusing task for you to do. But I am not a prince, the minstrel said, and only princes may aspire to Saralinda's hand. The cold Duke kept on grinning. Why then we'll make a prince of you, he said, the prince of rags and jingles. He clapped his hands together, and 2 varlets appeared without a word or sound. Take him to his dungeon, said the Duke. Feed him water without bread, and bread without water. The varlets were taking the minstrel out of the great hall, when down the marble stairs the Princess Saralinda floated like a cloud. The Duke's eyes gleamed like crystal. The minstrel gazed in wonder. The Princess Saralinda was tall, with friezes in her dark hair, and she wore serenity brightly like the rainbow. It was not easy to tell her mouth from the rose or her brow from the white lilac. Her voice was faraway music, and her eyes were candles burning on a tranquil night. She moved across the room like wind in violets. Her laughter sparkled on the air, which from her presence gained a faint and undreamed fragrance. The prince was frozen by her beauty, but not cold, and the Duke, who was cold but not frozen, held up the palms of his gloves as if she were a fire at which to warm his hands. The minstrel saw the blood come warmly to the lame man's cheeks. This thing of rags and tags and tatters will play our little game, he told his niece, his voice like iron on velvet. I wish him well, the princess said. The minstrel broke his bonds and took her hand in his, but it was slashed away by the swift cane of the Duke. Take him to this dungeon now, he said. He stared coldly at the minstrel through his monocle. You'll find the most amusing bats and spiders there. I wish him well, the princess said again, and the varlets took the minstrel to his dungeon. When the great iron door of the dungeon clanked behind the minstrel, he found himself alone in blackness. A spider, swinging on a strand of web, swung back and forth. The zickering of bats was echoed by the walls. The minstrel took a step, avoiding snakes, and something squirmed. Take care, the Golok said. You're on my foot. Why are you here? The minstrel cried. I forgot something. I forgot about the task the Duke will set you. The minstrel thought of swimming lakes too wide to swim, of turning liquids into stone, or finding boneless creatures made of bone. How came you here? He asked. And can you leave? I never know, the Golok said. My mother was a witch, but rather mediocre in her way. When she tried to turn a thing to gold, it turned to clay. And when she changed her rivals into fish, all she ever got was mermaids. The minstrel's heart was insecure. My father was a wizard, said his friend, who often cast his spells upon himself when he was in his cups. Strike a light or light a lantern. Something I have hold of has no head. The minstrel shuddered. The task, he said, you came to tell me? I did? Oh, yes. My father lacked the power of concentration, and that is bad for monks and priests, and worse for wizards. Listen, tell the Duke that you will hunt the boar, or travel thrice around the moon, or turn November into June. Implore him not to send you out to find 1,000 jewels. And then he'll send you out to find 1,000 jewels. But I am poor, the minstrel cried. Come, the Golok said. You're Zorn of Zorna. I had it from a traveler I met. It came to him as he was leaving town. Your father's casks and coffers shine with rubies and with sapphires. My father lives in Zorna, said the prince, and it would take me 99 days, 3 and 30 days to go, and 3 and 30 days to come back here. That's 6 and 60. It always takes my father 3 and 30 days to make decisions, said the prince. In spells and labors, a certain time is always set, and I might be at sea when mine expires. That's another problem for another day, the Golok said. Time is for dragonflies and angels. The former live too little, and the latter live too long. Zorn of Zorna thought a while and said, The task seems strange and simple. There are no jewels, the Golok said, within the reach and ranges of this island, except the gems here in this castle. The Duke knows not that you are Zorn of Zorna. He thinks you are a minstrel without a penny or a moonstone. He's fond of jewels. You've seen them on his gloves. The prince stepped on a turtle. The Duke has spies, he said, who may know who I am. The Golok sighed. I may be wrong, he said, but we must risk and try it. The prince sighed in his turn. I wish you could be surer. I wish I could, the Golok said. My mother was born, I regret to say, only partly in a call. I've saved a score of princes in my time. I cannot save them all. Something that would have been purple if there had been light to see it by scuttled across the floor. The Duke might give me only 30 days or 42 to find 1,000 jewels, said Zorn of Zorna. Why should he give me 99? The way I figure it, the Golok said, is this. The longer the labor lasts, the longer lasts his gloating. He loves to gloat, you know. The prince sat down beside a toad. My father may have lost his jewels, he said, or given them away. I thought of that, the Golok said, but I have other plans than one. Right now, we have to sleep. They found a corner without creatures and slept until the town clock struck the midnight hour. Chains clanked and rattled, and the great iron door began to move. The Duke has sent for you again, the Golok said. Be careful what you say and what you do. The great iron door began to open slowly. When shall I see you next? Zorn whispered. There was no answer. The prince groped around in the dark and felt a thing very like a cat and touched the thing without a head, but he could not find the Goloks. The great iron door was open wide now, and the dungeon filled with lantern light. The Duke commands your presence, growled a guard. What was that? What was what? I know not, said the guard. "I thought I heard the sound of someone laughing." "Is the Duke afraid of laughter?" asked the prince. "The Duke is not afraid of anything. Not even," said the guard, "the total." "The total?" "The total." "What's the total?" A lock of the guard's hair turned white and his teeth began to chatter. "The total looks like a blob of glup," he said. "It makes a sound like rabbits screaming and smells of old unopened rooms. It's waiting for the Duke to fail in some endeavor, such as setting you a task that you can do." "And if he sets me one and I succeed?" the prince inquired. "The blob will glup him," said the guard. "It's an agent of the devil sent to punish evildoers for having done less evil than they should. I talk too much. Come on, the Duke is waiting." Chapter 4, last one for today. The Duke sat at one end of a black oak table in the black oaked room, lighted by flaming torches that threw red gleams on shields and lances. The Duke's gloves sparkled when he moved his hands. He stared moodily through his monocle at young Prince Zorn. The Duke sneered, which made him even colder. "So, you would hunt the boar," he said, "or travel thrice around the moon, or turn November into June." He laughed and a torch went out. "Sourlinda in November turns November into June. A cow can travel thrice around the moon or even more, and anyone can merely hunt the boar. I have another plan for you. I thought it up myself last night when I was killing mice. I'll send you out to find 1,000 jewels and back." The prince turned pale, or tried to. "A wandering minstrel, I," he said, "a thing of rubies and sapphires." The Duke's chuckle sounded like ice cackling in a cauldron. "For you are Zorn of Zorna," he whispered softly. "Your father's casks and vaults and coffers shine with jewels. In 66 days you could sail to Zorna and return." "It always takes my father 33 days to make decisions," cried the prince. The Duke grinned. "That is what I wanted to know, my naive prince," he said. "Then you would have me give you 99 days?" "That would be fair," the prince replied. "But how do you know that I am Zorn?" "I have a spy named Hark," the Duke explained, "who found your princely raiment in your quarters in the town and brought it here, with certain signs and seals and signatures revealing who you are. Go put the raiment on." He pointed at a flight of iron stairs. "You'll find it in a chamber on whose door a star is turning black. Don it and return. I'll think of beetles while you're gone and things like that." The Duke limped to his chair and sat down again, and the prince started up the iron stairs, wondering where the Golux was. He stopped and turned and said, "You will not give me 99 days. How many then?" The Duke sneered. "I'll think of a lovely number," he said. "Go on." When Zorn came back, he wore his royal attire, but the Duke's spies had sealed his sword so that he could not draw it. The Duke sat staring at a man who wore a velvet mask and cloak and hood. "This is Hark," he said, "and this is Listen." He gestured with his cane at nothing. "There's no one there," said Zorn. "Listen is invisible," the Duke explained. "Listen can be heard but never seen. They are here to learn the mark and measure of your task. I give you 99 hours, not 99 days, to find 1,000 jewels and bring them here. When you return, the clocks must all be striking 5. "The clocks here in the castle?" asked the prince. "The 13 clocks?" "The clocks here in the castle," said the Duke. "The 13 clocks." The prince looked at the 2 clocks on the walls. Their hands pointed to 10 minutes of 5. "The hands are frozen," the prince said. "The clocks are dead." "Precisely," said the Duke, "and what is more, which makes your task a charming one, there are no jewels that could be found within the space of 99 hours, except those in my vaults, and these." He held his gloves up and they sparkled. "A pretty task," said Hark. Ingenious, said the voice of Listen. I thought you'd like it, said the Duke. Unseal his sword. Invisible hands unsealed the prince's sword. And if I should succeed? Asked Zorn. The Duke waved a gloved hand at the iron stairs, and Zorn saw Saralinda standing there. I wish him well, she said, and her uncle laughed and looked at Zorn. I hired a witch, he said, to cast a tiny spell on her. When she is in my presence, all that she can ever say is this, I wish him well. You like it? A clever spell, said Hark. An awful spell, the voice of Listen said. The prince and princess spoke a silent language with their eyes, until the Duke cried, Go! And Saralinda vanished up the stairs. And if I fail, said Zorn. The Duke removed his sword from his sword cane and ran his glove along the blade. I'll slit you from your guggle to your zatch and feed you to the total. I've heard of it, said Zorn. The Duke smiled. You've only heard of half of it, he said. The other half is worse. It's made of lip. It feels as if it has been dead at least a dozen days, but it moves about like monkeys and like shadows. The prince took out his sword and put it back. The total can't be killed, the Duke said softly. It gleeps, said Hark. What's gleeping? Asked the prince. The Duke and Hark and Listen laughed. Time is wasting, Prince, the Duke reminded him. Already you have only 98 hours. I wish you every strangest kind of luck. A wide oak door suddenly opened at the end of the room, and the prince saw lightning and midnight and falling rain. One last word and warning, said the Duke. I would not trust the Golux over far. He cannot tell what can be from what can't. He seldom knows what should be from what is. The prince glanced at Hark and at the Duke, and at a spot where he thought Listen stood. When all the clocks are striking 5, he said, and left the room. The laughter of the Duke and Hark and Listen followed him out the door and down the stairs and into the darkness. When he had gone a few steps from the castle, he looked up at a lighted window and thought he saw the Princess Saralinda standing there. A rose fell at his feet, and as he picked it up, the laughter of the Duke and Hark and Listen increased inside the black oak room and died away. And that is the first half of the 13 Clocks by James Thurber. Join me next time for the last half, chapters 5 through 8.